So welcome everyone. This is April 4th, 2009. Sometimes when I start off and I try to say the date, I completely glitch. I think, whoa, that's not a good sign. And this is a Pathwork teleconference on spiritual and emotional health through restitution for real guilt, and it's Pathwork Guide Lecture 109. And as I was reading through and prepping for this afternoon, naturally that's the time I read the part of the lecture that says, as I said in the lecture before. And I thought, oh dear, you better go back and pick up that lecture. So sometimes the guide references, he says, as I have said before, and that's very vague. There's not much you can do with that, except do a lot of homework. But sometimes he's very specific, and he'll say, this is a continuation of the last lecture, and that happens a lot. So I'm going to pick up a little bit from the preceding lecture, because some of the ways, some of the things that were expressed in that one will help support an understanding of this lecture. So in a lecture, the shorthand version is Restitution for Real Guilt. It's important to know what kind of guilt we're talking about. And the guilt that the guide is working to address in these two lectures is not as simple as having done something and not admitted it or made up for it and not wanting to be caught. It's a bit more subtle than that. So the primary guilt that the guide addresses in the previous lecture is the guilt for not wanting to love. And the guide indicates that that's really the source of all guilt. It's the source of all problems. So in the guilt for not loving, what he's saying is that all guilt comes from our lower self. So you may not have done anything that you are actively aware of that you feel guilty about, but guilt shows up in many ways, part of what this lecture is about. So guilt, I looked it up in the dictionary. Seemed like a good place to start. And it says being responsible for the commission of an offense. And yet in the lecture, it uses a phrase that means a lot to me because it's also used in Jewish prayers, especially on Yom Kippur. And it talks about that there's guilt around commission and omission. So you can do something active that isn't right, or basically it's part of your lower self acting out. But that there is also a guilt that we carry for things we have not done. And that is more subtle. That's harder to get your hands on. So a lot of the guilt that this lecture talks about, when the guide talks about the sin, to some extent, of not loving. Well, the loving would be active. The not loving, how do you find that? How do you see it? How do you touch it? How do you address it? So one aspect of this is that if you're aligned with your lower self, wherever you're aligned with your lower self or acting out on the basis of your lower self, you're going to have problems in your life. So you can kind of toss all the areas that are going swimmingly, because those are probably not areas that you're aligned with your lower self, or if you are, it's not to the surface yet. So it's hard. You're not going to get a lot back out of looking at the happy times, the good times, the things that seem to roll smoothly. And that's another thing that the guide talks about in these lectures, is that one of the manifestations of the sin of not loving is trying to hold back the life force. So the guide's saying that the natural state of being is to let the life force move through you, to be in the flow of life. He uses water terms a lot. He uses, at one point he talks about floating, that there's a place of floating with the energy of the universe that allows you to move spontaneously, depending on what the circumstances are. And that when we contract and basically say, I won't, or I'm afraid, or I'm not good enough. In that contraction, we're not allowing the flow of energy to move through us. We're creating a dam, a stagnation of energy, based on the fact that we're afraid, that we're invested, that if we let the flow of life move, you're going to find something out about me. Society will find out that I'm not good if I allow myself to be who I am. Now, a few nights ago, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend Leonard Cohen's concert here in Austin. And I think I'm very fortunate because the tickets were very, very hard to get. And at that concert, when you observe the gentleman, he's older. He makes a joke at one point about when he was a kid of 60 with a crazy dream, because that's the last time he did concerts. I think he's 75 now. And he's an unusual man, and he's odd, and his stage presence is unusual. And what I got out of watching him was, for one thing, everybody in the audience adored him. I don't think I've heard applause like that and cheering like that for a performer. And the second thing I noticed was that nobody cared that he was odd. I don't want to go into the mannerisms, but he's an unusual person. And nobody cared. They just wanted to hear him. They just wanted to experience the gentleman's talent and the energy that he put out. And what I took away from that was a sense of my own self where I'm a little bit afraid to put myself out and to be natural, because maybe it'll look funny or odd, or I make too much. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks with aspects of yourself that you tend to hold back or prune. This is what the guide is talking about. Now, he's not saying that this is the worst thing in the world. He's simply saying that in doing this, we're restricting our life flow, and on some level of our being, this is not love. This is not being loving. Besides the fact that you're not willing to be out there and meet another human being the way you are. There's a place where you have judged who you are, and where you're only going to allow out what you think will be accepted, which to some extent shortchanges the other person. So when I say it's not a loving thing to do to withhold yourself, it's not loving to you. It doesn't show a self-acceptance of yourself. It also does not allow another person to witness your real self. So when we only put out what looks good, you wind up with a world full of only actions that look good, and it encourages people who have doubts about themselves not to put themselves out, because, well, I'm not that good. So in a slightly circular way, any unlovingness that you feel about yourself, any place where you hold yourself back from loving, you are also setting a stage for someone else to do the same thing. To some extent, you are inviting them to collude that only the best should be put forward.